Welcome everyone. Today we are going to be learning about our last method for solving quadratics, which is the quadratic formula. So in another video, we showed that the quadratic formula comes from solving a quadratic with just general coefficients a, b, and c, any quadratic, by completing the square. So when we complete the square, we find the solutions to this quadratic are x equals, and then we get the quadratic formula, which uses these coefficients a, b, and c. So the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and all of that is divided by 2a. So when we plug in a, b, and c into these spots in our formula, we end up, and then if we simplify, we end up with the two solutions for x. And we'll usually get two solutions because we have this plus or minus in front of our square root. So this is our quadratic formula, our final method for solving quadratics. One note is this can be used to solve any quadratic. Completing the square is another method that we could use to solve any quadratic. So both of those methods can be used for any quadratic that we encounter. So we're going to go through two examples of using the quadratic formula. Our first example looks at the equation 2x squared minus 12x plus 16 equals 0. So we want to make sure that we have our quadratic on the left and then 0 on the right side. To start off, we want to identify what a, b, and c are. So as we can see, a is equal to 2, b is equal to negative 12, and c is equal to 16. We take those values, a, b, and c, and then plug them in to our spots for a, b, and c in our quadratic formula. I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to bring it all down so that we can take a look at it. Okay, so we have negative b. B is negative 12, so negative 12, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so b is negative 12 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 16, all divided by 2 times a, which is 2. So all we're doing is substituting a, b, and c for the a, b, and c's that we see in our quadratic formula. Then we have to simplify. The most difficult part of the quadratic formula, aside from remembering it, is just being careful when we're simplifying, because there are many operations in this formula, so it's easy to make a mistake somewhere along the way. I usually start with the inside of the square root. So let's take a look there first. Negative 12 squared gives us 144, minus 4 times 2 is 8, and 8 times 16 gives us 128. And that's all over 2 times 2, which is 4. So you can simplify other parts as you go along. We just want to be careful. Okay, so I'm also going to simplify what we have in front of here. So negative 12 is just going to give us a positive 12, plus or minus the square root of, so continuing to simplify inside of our square root, 144 minus 128 gives us 16. So square root of 16, and still divided by 4. And the entire thing is divided by 4, so both of the terms that we have there. Okay, so square root of 16 we know is 4, so x equals 12 plus or minus 4 divided by 4. And now at this point, we want to split up our solutions into the two possible positive and negative values. So x equals 12 plus 4 divided by 4, or x equals 12 minus 4 divided by 4. And if we simplify these, we get x equals 16 divided by 4, which is 4, or x equals 8 divided by 4, which is 2. So our two solutions for our quadratic that we started with up here are 4 and 2. And we found those by using the quadratic formula. We're going to look in another video at identifying the fastest method to use. Here, for example, it might have been faster to factor our quadratic instead of going through this entire formula. But for this video, we're going to practice using our formula. Okay, so here we did a quick example of our quadratic formula. We have one more example to go through. All right, so for this example, we have negative 3x squared minus 30x plus 7 equals 57. So here, notice we have our quadratic on the left, but we don't have 0 on the right. So we need to make sure before we use our quadratic formula that our equation looks like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the first thing we're going to do for this quadratic is subtract that 57 from both sides. That way we get negative 3x squared minus 30x minus 50 equals 0. So now we have 0 on the right side, which means we can use our quadratic formula. We'll start off again by identifying a, b, and c. A is negative 3, b is negative 30. So the sign here, whether we're adding or subtracting, is important also. And finally, c is negative 50. Okay, so again, using our quadratic formula, x equals negative b, negative 30, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 30 squared, minus 4 times a, which is negative 3, times c, which is negative 50, all over 2 times a, which is negative 3. So just plugging in a, b, and c into our formula. Again, we'll start by simplifying inside of the square root. First, in front here, we have a negative 30, so that just gives us positive 30. Plus or minus the square root of negative 30 squared is 900. And we have 900 minus 4 times negative 3, which is negative 12, times negative 50 gives us 600, positive 600. So 900 minus 600 divided by 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. Okay, so continuing to simplify our square root, we have 30 plus or minus the square root of 900 minus 600 gives us 300. All divided by negative 6. Now we could use a calculator, try and find the square root of 300. When I type in the square root of 300 in my calculator, I end up with a decimal, 17.32 ... So we actually end up with an irrational number. So this decimal keeps going on forever and doesn't stop. What that means is that we don't have a perfect square here. 300 is not a perfect square. In this class, Algebra 1, at this point, we're just going to leave 300 under the square root and just leave it as square root of 300 in our answer. So we can't do any more simplifying with this term. What we can do, however, is take a look at this negative 6. And we're dividing both 30 and the square root of 300, so both of those terms, by negative 6. Another way to write this is 30 divided by negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 300 divided by negative 6. If we simplify this first term, 30 divided by negative 6 gives us negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 300 divided by negative 6. So if we wanted to simplify completely, we would get these answers for our solutions. Oops. Negative 5, and we have two answers here because we have the plus or minus. So negative 5 plus square root of 300 divided by negative 6, or negative 5 minus square root of 300 divided by negative 6. Those are our two solutions. This would be our, for this class, we would say that this is our simplified solution. So if you can, try and divide the first term by that denominator. In our first example, we had a perfect square, 16, underneath our square root. So we ended up with two integer solutions. Down here, we didn't have a perfect square, so we just left it under the square root, and we have irrational solutions. So two quick examples of how to use our quadratic formula, identifying A, B, and C, and then just plugging those in and working through carefully all the operations.